Sound of a powerful high-end car engine revving, followed by the sickening tear of wet earth. Voiceover. She looked at my life's work, the soil my father bled for, and saw nothing but a parking space. She told me I was trespassing on my own land. But she didn't know the first rule of the farm. Never corner an animal unless you're prepared for the consequences. And I had a 20-ton tractor and a mountain of fresh consequences waiting. The morning air, thick with the scent of damp earth and sweet alfalfa, was Jedediah's church. He stood on his porch, a steaming mug of black coffee warming his calloused hands, and watched the mist burn off the long pasture that bordered the immaculate, soulless expanse of the estates at Willow Creek. 20 years ago, that land had been the Thompson farm. Now, it was a grid of oversized houses painted in 50 shades of beige, each with a lawn so manicured it looked like a plastic carpet. His own 400 acres felt like a defiant living island in a sea of sterile HOA covenants, his father had warned him. They'll come for this land next, Jed. They'll come with their checkbooks and their lawyers, and they'll talk about progress. His father had died fighting them, a heart attack in the middle of a tense town hall meeting. Jed had taken over the fight, a silent, stubborn war waged with property line fences and the steady, unapologetic rhythm of farm life. The low rumble began as a distant annoyance, a sound that didn't belong with the gentle lowing of his dairy cows or the crow of the rooster. It grew louder, a purr of disciplined power that scraped against the morning's peace. Jed's eyes narrowed. He saw it then, a gleaming silver Mercedes sedan, the kind that probably cost more than his tractor, turning off the pristine asphalt of the estates and onto the soft, grassy shoulder of his property. It didn't stop there. With an arrogance that made Jed's teeth ache, the car nosed directly onto his pasture, its tires sinking immediately into the rain-softened soil. Jed set his mug down on the railing with a sharp clink. He moved without haste, his worn leather boots eating up the distance between the porch and the fence line. Each step was deliberate, a slow-burning fuse. He could already see the dark, muddy tracks the car was carving into the field. A field. He'd just spent a week irrigating and seeding. That was money. That was time. That was his livelihood. A woman emerged from the driver's side. She was a caricature of wealth, all sharp angles and expensive fabrics. Her blonde hair was shellacked into a perfect helmet. Her oversized sunglasses hid her eyes, but not her disdain as she surveyed the mud now clinging to her tires. She held a phone to her ear, her voice a sharp, impatient staccato that carried across the field. "No, Jillian, I'm here. It's the only spot with a clear view of the event tent. This whole field is empty. Honestly, you'd think they'd have arranged for proper valet." Jed reached the fence. He didn't raise his voice. "Ma'am." The woman, Carol, as she would later be known in his mind, ignored him. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger toward a large white tent being erected a quarter-mile away, deep inside the subdivision. It was the annual HOA Founders' Day Gala, a thing Jed actively ignored every year. "Ma'am," he said again, a little louder this time. He unlatched the gate and stepped through, walking directly toward her. She finally lowered her phone, her lips pressed into a thin line of annoyance. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone suggesting he was a particularly bothersome insect. "You're on private property," Jed said, keeping his voice level. He gestured to the deep, muddy gouges her car had made. "And you're tearing up my pasture." She let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Oh, please, it's a field. Don't be so dramatic." She turned her attention back to her car, popping the trunk to retrieve a designer handbag. "We need to park here for the gala. The street parking is already a nightmare." "This isn't here," Jed countered, the fuse burning shorter. "This is my farm. This is my land. The estates at Willow Creek ends at that road." He pointed to the asphalt. Carol finally gave him her full attention, but it wasn't the kind he wanted. She pushed her sunglasses on top of her head, revealing cold, dismissive eyes. She looked him up and down, taking in his faded flannel shirt, his dirt-stained jeans, his weathered face. Her expression was one of utter contempt. "Listen, I don't have time for this," she snapped. "The Willow Creek Homeowners Association has an easement for event overflow. It was all in the county filings when they approved this ridiculous farm to be grandfathered in next to a luxury community." Jed's blood ran cold, then hot. "There is no easement, I'd know. I own this land outright. Now I'm telling you to get your car off my property before I call the sheriff." The threat didn't land. It seemed to amuse her. "You do that. I'm Carol Peterson. My husband is Richard Peterson of Peterson, Davies, and Finch. He's also the head of the HOA board. By the time your hick sheriff gets here, I'll have him writing you a ticket for harassment." Before Jed could respond, another luxury vehicle, this time a black BMW SUV, followed the Mercedes tracks, pulling. Up 20 feet away, a man in a pastel polo shirt got out and waved at Carol. "Perfect spot, Carol. Knew you'd find a way around the mob." "They're trying to give me trouble about it," Carol called back, waving a dismissive hand in Jed's direction. The man barely glanced at Jed. "Don't worry about him. He's just the farmer. The HOA has this covered." Jed felt something snap inside him. The quiet, simmering anger that had been his constant companion for years began to boil over. He was no longer just a farmer. He was an obstacle, a piece of scenery to be ignored. "This is your final warning," Jed said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "Get off my land." Carol rolled her eyes and turned her back on him, raising her phone to her ear again. "Jillian, you can tell everyone to park in the big empty field. The farmer is being a little grumpy, but he'll get over it." That was it. That was the moment. The disrespect was so profound, so absolute, it was almost clarifying. He wasn't dealing with a rational person. He was dealing with an invader. And you don't reason with an invasion. You repel it. Jed turned without another word and walked away. Carol smirked at his retreating back, assuming she had won. The man in the polo shirt chuckled. They watched as Jed walked not toward his house, but toward the massive aging barn that stood like a sentinel at the heart of his property. They heard the groan of the huge sliding door. Then came a new sound. It wasn't the purr of a luxury engine. It was the stuttering cough, then the deafening, ground-shaking roar of a diesel engine coming to life. A moment later, the front end of his John Deere 7810 tractor emerged from the shadowy maw of the barn. It was a beast of a machine, caked in the honest dirt of 1,000 days of hard labor. Its tires were taller than Carol Peterson. She watched, a flicker of annoyance on her face, as the tractor rumbled out into the yard. She probably thought he was trying to intimidate her with noise, a childish tantrum. More cars were arriving. Now, a procession of Audis, Lexuses, and another Mercedes, all following her lead, creating a line of shining metal sinking into his wounded field. No one paid the tractor much mind. Jed didn't drive toward them. He drove toward the far side of the barn, toward a massive dark mountain. It was a fixture of the farm, a testament to the daily, unglamorous work of running a dairy operation. It was a 3-month accumulation of manure and soiled hay from the cattle stalls, a rich, steaming, formidable pile of cow dung that stood 15 feet high. He expertly maneuvered the tractor, lowering the huge front-end loader. The hydraulic hiss cut through the air. With a groan of mechanics and a surge of engine power, he pushed the loader deep into the base of the manure mountain. He lifted, the front wheels of the tractor rising slightly under the immense weight. The bucket came up dripping, loaded with nearly 2 tons of the foulest, wettest, most pungent material on the farm. Jed swiveled the tractor around. He now faced the neat line of gleaming, expensive cars. He could see Carol, phone to her ear, finally looking over with a frown, her expression shifting from annoyance to confusion. The other HOA members were also starting to stare, their party chatter faltering. They had wanted his field for overflow, parking. He was about to give them an overflow of his own. A grim, hard smile touched Jed's lips for the first time that day. He pushed the throttle forward, and the great green beast, laden with its stinking payload, began to roll toward them. The world seemed to move in slow motion. The rumble of the John Deere's engine was a deep-throated growl that vibrated through the soles of their expensive shoes. For the assembled members of the Willow Creek HOA, the sight of the tractor was an absurdity, a piece of rustic theater. They were still smiling, some filming with their phones, ready to post a clip of the hilarious grumpy farmer to their social media. The smiles froze, then melted into slack-jawed disbelief as the tractor didn't stop, didn't swerve, didn't slow down. Jed aimed for the lead car, the silver Mercedes, the one that had carved the first wound into his land. He felt a profound, almost spiritual calm settle over him. This wasn't anger anymore. It was an act of balancing the scales. He was a farmer, and this was how a farmer tended his fields, by rooting out the pests. He stopped the tractor 10 feet from the car's gleaming hood. The engine idled, a rhythmic, powerful chug-chug-chug that was the farm's own heartbeat. Carol Peterson had her hand to her mouth, her eyes wide with a confusion that was rapidly souring into fear. The man in the polo shirt took a hesitant step forward. "Hey! Hey, man! What do you think you're doing?" Jed ignored him. His gaze was fixed on the Mercedes. He pulled a lever. The hydraulic hiss was deafeningly loud in the sudden silence. The massive front-end loader, filled to the brim with its dark, steaming cargo, began to tilt forward. It was a slow, deliberate, agonizingly graceful movement. A few people screamed. Others scrambled back, tripping in the mud. Then the world erupted in brown. It wasn't a simple dump. It was a cascade, a thick, wet, stinking avalanche of digested alfalfa and bovine waste. 2 tons of it slammed onto the hood of the Mercedes, with a sound like a mudslide hitting a tin shed, a deep, wet, percussive thump splat. The car's suspension groaned, visibly sinking under the sudden weight. The manure didn't stop there. It flowed like a foul lava flow over the hood, up the windshield, and onto the roof, splattering in a wide, sickening radius. Chunks of it hit the neighboring BMW. The air, once scented with cut grass and morning dew, was instantly bludgeoned by the overwhelming, eye-watering stench of a feedlot in mid-August. For a full 5 seconds, there was absolute silence, broken only by the steady idle of the tractor and the soft, wet, plopping sounds of dung sliding off the car onto the grass. Carol Peterson broke the silence. The sound she made was not entirely human. It was a high-pitched, strangled shriek of pure, unadulterated rage. "My car! My Mercedes! He... She pointed a trembling, perfectly manicured finger at Jed, who sat impassively in the tractor's cab, his face a mask of stone. "You maniac! You filthy animal! I'll have you jailed for this! I'll sue you for everything you have! I'll own this stinking patch of dirt!" Jed simply lowered the now empty bucket, the metal scraping against the ground. He pulled another lever, and with another hydraulic hiss, he disengaged the loader attachment, letting it drop onto the grass. Then he put the tractor in reverse and backed away, maneuvering it with practiced ease until it was parked neatly beside his barn. He killed the engine. The sudden silence that followed was even more profound than before. He swung himself down. From the cab, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. He walked toward the fence line, not even glancing at the chaos he had wrought. He could hear the babble of panicked, furious voices behind him. Phones were out again, but no one was laughing now. They were all talking at once, voices shrill. With indignation. "Did you see that? He's completely unhinged. My shoes are ruined. The smell. Oh, God, the smell is in my hair. Call the police. Somebody call 911. This is assault." Carol was already on her phone, her voice a screeching weapon. Yes, 911. I need an officer at the estates at Willow Creek immediately. A man has attacked us. He dumped feces all over my car. He's a menace. He needs to be arrested. Jed leaned against his fence post, folded his arms, and waited. He knew the sheriff, a man named Brody, a good 20 years. Brody's father had sold the Hendersons their first bull. Brody understood the language of property lines and stubborn old farmers. He also understood the language of new money and entitlement, a language he'd been forced to become fluent in since the estates went up. 10 minutes later, the wail of a siren cut through the air. A county sheriff's cruiser, dusty and well-used, pulled up along the road, a stark contrast to the mud-stuck luxury cars. Sheriff Brody stepped out. He was a big man, gone a little soft around the middle, his face permanently etched with an expression of weary patience. He put on his hat, adjusted his belt, and took in the scene with a long, slow scan. He saw the line of cars buried to their hubcaps in mud. He saw the crowd of impeccably dressed people gesticulating wildly. And he saw the silver Mercedes, looking like it had been birthed from the bowels of a giant cow. Finally, his eyes landed on Jed, standing calmly by his fence. Brody sighed. It was a deep, heartfelt sigh that spoke of paperwork and headaches. He walked past the clamoring HOA members, holding up a hand to forestall their verbal assault, and went directly to Jed. "Jed," he said, his voice low, "don't suppose you'd care to tell me what in the Sam Hill is going on here?" "Morning, Frank," Jed said calmly. "They were trespassing." "Trespassing?" Brody said, looking over at the dung-covered car. "This looks a little more than a trespassing complaint." Before Jed could answer, Carol Peterson marched up to them, her face blotchy and red with fury. Her lawyer husband was evidently still on his way. "Don't you talk to him, Sheriff! He is the perpetrator! He vandalized my vehicle! That is a $100,000 car! I want him in handcuffs now!" Sheriff Brody turned to her. His weary expression didn't change. "Ma'am, is this your vehicle?" He gestured with his chin toward the Mercedes. "Yes, and I want him charged to the fullest extent of the law. Destruction of property, assault, reckless endangerment." "I see," Brody said, taking out a small notepad. "And is this your property you're parked on?" Carol's mouth opened and closed. We had to park here for the gala. The HOA has an easement." "No, you don't," Brody said flatly, not looking up from his pad. "I've been sheriff in this county for 15 years. I know every easement and right-of-way from here to the state line. The Henderson farm has no such public easement. So, I'll ask you again, are you on your property?" A man in a golf visor stepped forward. "Now see here, Sheriff. We are members of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. We represent a significant tax base in this county." Brody finally looked up, and the weariness in his eyes had been replaced by a flinty hardness. "I'm aware. I'm also aware that the law is the law, whether you're in a $500,000 house or a two-room shack. From where I'm standing, I see a dozen vehicles committing criminal trespass. I see significant damage to Mr. Henderson's pasture, which is a civil matter you can be sure he'll be filing. And I see a creative solution to a recurring problem." He turned back to Carol. "Did Mr. Henderson ask you to leave his property?" "He was rude and threatening," she shot back. "That's not what I asked, ma'am. Did he, or did he, not ask you to remove your vehicles from his land?" There was a tense silence. The man in the polo shirt mumbled, "Well, yes, he did, but—" "Then you were warned," Brody concluded. He looked at the crowd. "Now here's what's going to happen. You are all going to get in your cars, those of you who can, and get them off this man's property immediately. I'm not writing a dozen trespassing tickets today because my hand will cramp up. Once you are off the property, anyone who feels they are a victim of a crime can wait for me over on the road, and I will take your statement." The crowd erupted. The injustice of it, in their eyes, was breathtaking. They were the victims here, not the farmer who had just buried a Mercedes in manure. Carol's face had gone from red to a deathly pale. Her voice was low and shaking with a rage so profound it was almost silent. "This is outrageous. You are protecting a criminal. When my husband gets here, he will have your badge." Brody met her gaze. "Your husband is a lawyer, ma'am, not the king of the county. He knows perfectly well what trespassing is." Just as he said it, a low-slung, menacingly quiet black Cadillac sedan pulled up on the road. The driver's door opened, and a man in a perfectly tailored gray suit stepped out. He was tall, thin, with silver hair and the predatory stillness of a hawk. He didn't look at the crowd or the sheriff. His cold blue eyes scanned the scene, the muddy field, the buried Mercedes, the stoic farmer and his furious wife. And a flicker of something unreadable passed across his face. This was Richard Peterson. He walked over, his expensive dress shoes somehow avoiding the worst of the mud. He put a hand on his wife's arm, a gesture that was meant to be calming but looked more like he was taking possession of an object. "What seems to be the problem, officer?" he asked, his voice smooth and devoid of emotion. Sheriff Brody squared his shoulders. "Mr. Peterson, your wife and her friends here were trespassing on private land." Richard Peterson's eyes finally moved to Jed. They were utterly devoid of the hot anger that fueled his wife. Instead, they were filled with a chilling, analytical coldness. It was the look of a man who didn't see people, but problems to be solved, obstacles to be crushed. He looked at Jed, then at the tractor, and then back at Jed. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if confirming a calculation in his head. Then he looked back at the sheriff, a thin, cruel smile touching his lips. "I see." Jed met Richard Peterson's gaze and felt a different kind of chill, one that had nothing to do with the morning air. Carol's rage was a wildfire, hot and loud but ultimately containable. This man's anger was a glacier, cold, silent, and capable of grinding mountains to dust. "This farm isn't for sale," Jed said, his voice a low rumble. Richard's thin smile returned. It didn't touch his eyes. "Everything is for sale, Mr. Henderson. It's just a matter of making the owner understand the correct price." He turned to Sheriff Brody. "Sheriff, I assume you'll be taking this man's statement, and mine, and the statements of the dozen other victims of his agricultural assault?" "I'll take everyone's statement down on the road, like I said," Brody replied, his hand resting on his service belt. He was trying to project authority, but he looked like a man standing on a beach, watching a tidal wave form on the horizon. "But the trespassing issue comes first." "Of course," Richard said smoothly. He pulled a pristine folded handkerchief from his suit pocket and dabbed at a speck of mud that had landed on his shoe. "Let's not get bogged down in the procedural weeds. The simple facts are these. A misdemeanor trespass, which I'm sure was a simple misunderstanding about property lines, was met with what appears to be felony vandalism, malicious mischief, and arguably assault with a deadly something." He gestured to the dung-covered car. "I'm sure the DA will have fun with the specific charge. The point is, the response was disproportionate, and the law loves proportion." He spoke with the unhurried confidence of a man who didn't just know the law, but who bent it to his will for a living. He was performing for the sheriff, for Jed, for his fuming audience of HOA members, laying the groundwork for the narrative he would soon build. Jedediah Henderson, the unhinged, dangerous farmer. "You have a tow truck coming for your wife's car?" Brody asked, his tone clipped. "I have a flatbed on its way from the city," Richard corrected him. "It will be placed in a sealed container and taken to a forensic analysis facility to fully document the extent of the damage and the biological contaminants used. Every ounce will be weighed. Every scratch will be cataloged. We will be thorough." The threat was clear. This wasn't about getting the car cleaned. It was about building a mountain of evidence for a lawsuit designed to bankrupt Jed. Jed felt a surge of defiance. "While you're at it," he said, looking Richard in the eye, "I'll be getting a quote from the ag co-op on what it costs to regrade and reseed a pasture contaminated by the tire treads and fluid leaks of a dozen trespassing vehicles. I'll be thorough, too." Richard's eyes narrowed. For a split second, the mask of cool civility slipped, revealing the predator beneath. He had expected a blustering, ignorant farmer. He had not expected a man who would stand his ground and throw the language of litigation right back at him. He gave a short, sharp nod. "So, that's how it will be." It wasn't a question. He turned and guided his wife, who was now weeping, dramatically back toward his Cadillac. The rest of the HOA members, seeing their leader had taken control, began to retreat as well, a gaggle of furious whispers and resentful glares. The battle of the field was over. The war had just been declared. Over. The next 2 hours, the pasture became a circus of humiliation. A procession of tow trucks, the kind used for common accidents, not Richard's specialized flatbed, arrived to pull the luxury cars from the mud. The process was noisy and ugly. Engines whined, tires spun uselessly, and more of Jed's precious pasture was churned into a brown slurry. Each rescued car, caked in mud and flecked with dung, was a rolling monument to its owner's arrogance. Jed watched the whole thing from his porch, drinking another cup of coffee. Sheriff Brody stayed until the last car was gone, took a final, tired statement from Jed, and left with a grim parting word. "Watch your back, Jed. Peterson's not the kind of man who loses. He'll use the county, the courts, anything he can get his hands on. He'll try to break you." "Let him try," Jed had said. But the bravado felt hollow as he watched Brody's cruiser disappear down the road. The rest of the day passed in the familiar rhythm of farm work. He mended a fence, checked on a newborn calf, and cleared a jam in the hay baler. But a shadow hung over it all. Every mundane task was underscored by Richard Peterson's parting threat. "You just cost yourself this farm." He found himself looking at the rolling green hills, the sturdy oak his great-grandfather had planted, the barn his father had raised with his own 2 hands, and saw them not as his heritage, but as a battlefield. The first shot was fired 2 days later. It didn't come with a summons or a lawyer's letter. It came in the form of a crisp, white county vehicle rolling up his driveway. A woman in a severe pantsuit, carrying a clipboard like a weapon, introduced herself as being from the County Environmental Protection Division. "Mr. Henderson," she began, her voice devoid of any warmth, "we've received an anonymous complaint regarding potential violations of the county's watershed protection ordinance, specifically concerning uncontained agricultural runoff." She was looking directly at the manure mountain. "That's a compost pile," Jed said, his jaw tightening. "Been there in some form or another for 70 years. It's how we fertilize the fields." "As of County Ordinance 11B passed in 2018, she recited, as if reading from a script, "any agricultural compost pile exceeding 10 cubic yards must be located at least 300 feet from any residential property line and must be contained by a concrete or synthetic barrier to prevent groundwater contamination." Jed stared at her. His pile was 50 feet from the fence line. It had never been a problem. It was part of a farm. Ordinance 11B? That was the one the estates developers pushed through. It was for new construction, for septic tanks. "The language is broad," the inspector said, making a note on her clipboard. "It applies to any potential source of contamination." She walked the perimeter of his property, her eyes scanning everything. She noted the 50-year-old diesel tank that supplied his tractor. She noted the drainage ditch that ran from the cow stalls toward the creek. She noted the rusting hulk of his father's first tractor, a dead machine he kept for sentimental reasons. Each observation was a check mark on her sheet, a new violation, a new front in Richard Peterson's war. She left him with a preliminary report and a notice to comply. He had 30 days to build a multi-thousand-dollar concrete containment wall for his manure, 60 days to pay for a soil and water analysis to prove he wasn't poisoning the county, and 10 days to remove the derelict vehicle that was his father's tractor. The fines for non-compliance were ruinous, starting at $500 a day per violation. That night, Jed sat at his heavy oak kitchen table, the inspector's report spread out before him. The legal jargon was dense, suffocating. It was designed to confuse and overwhelm. For the first time, he felt a flicker of real fear. The dung had been a simple, direct solution. But how could he fight this? How could he fight a war waged with paragraphs and subclauses where the very act of being a farmer was being recategorized as a crime? His father's face stared back at him from a framed photo on the wall. He remembered his father's words, tired and frustrated after another losing battle at the town hall. They don't fight fair, Jed. They don't fight with their hands. They fight with paper. They'll bury you in it until you can't breathe. The phone rang, jarring him from his thoughts. He expected it might be Sheriff Brody calling to check in. But it wasn't. Am I speaking to Jedediah Henderson? The voice was old, raspy, and crackled with a dry wit. This is he. Name's Abe Zimmerman. I was your father's lawyer for about 30 years. Before I retired and got too old to deal with fools. Your dad was a good man. Stubborn as a mule stuck in a mud hole. But a good man. Jed was taken aback. He hadn't spoken to Abe in years. Mr. Zimmerman, it's good to hear your voice. Wish it were under better circumstances, Abe rasped. Word travels fast in a small town. Faster when it involves a Mercedes and a mountain of cow crap. That was a nice touch, by the way. Very poetic. Jed managed a small, tired smile. Felt right at the time. Feeling a little different now, I imagine, Abe said, his voice turning serious. I just got off the phone with a friend of mine down at the county clerk's office. Richard Peterson, acting on behalf of the Willow Creek HOA, filed a nuisance lawsuit against you this afternoon. But that's not the interesting part. He also filed a petition for a zoning variance review for your entire property. Jed felt the blood drain from his face. A what? He's claiming your farm's grandfathered agricultural status is null and void because your operation has substantially changed over the past 50 years. He's arguing that under current county development master plans, this land should be zoned R1, single-family residential. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. It wasn't about the car anymore. It wasn't about fines or code violations. It was the end game. Richard Peterson wasn't just trying to break him, he was trying to erase him. He was using the power of the law to declare that Jed's farm, his home, his entire life should no longer exist. The mountain of paper his father had warned him about was real, and it was about to come crashing down on his head. The silence on the phone line was a yawning chasm, filled with the static of Jed's crumbling world. Rezoned? He finally managed to say, the words tasting like ash. They can just do that? They can just decide my farm isn't a farm anymore. They can petition, Abe Zimmerman's raspy voice crackled back. And in a county where the tax revenue from one of those McMansions is 10 times what they get from 400 acres of agricultural land, a petition from a man like Richard Peterson gets listened to. He's not just filing a lawsuit against you, son. He's filing an eviction notice against your entire way of life. Jed sank into a chair at his kitchen table, the inspector's report looking like a trivial annoyance in comparison. The fines, the containment wall, the removal of his father's tractor, that was all a smokescreen. The real attack was aimed at the heart of it all, at the very definition of the land he stood on. What do I do, Abe? The question was quiet, stripped of the defiance he'd shown in the field. He felt like a man facing a hurricane with a hammer. You don't do a damn thing tonight except get some sleep, Abe ordered. Tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock, you come to my house, the old white one behind the post office, and you bring Every piece of paper you have on this farm, the deed, the titles, your tax records, your grandfather's will if you can find it, and bring that inspector's report. Peterson is fighting with paper. We're going to have to build a bigger mountain." The next morning, Jed sat in Abe Zimmerman's dusty, book-lined study. The air smelled of old paper, pipe tobacco, and a faint hint of peppermint. Abe, a small, bird-like man with eyes that were still fiercely intelligent behind thick glasses, pored over the documents spread across his massive desk. He hummed and grunted, his bony fingers tracing lines of legal text that were nearly a century old. "He's clever, that son of a bitch," Abe muttered, tapping a yellowed plat map from 1952. Peterson's argument about a substantial change in operation is nonsense, but it's the kind of legal footing that lets a judge grant the review. He'll argue your dairy operation is more industrial than the simple crop farm it was 70 years ago. More noise, more smell, more impact. It's a classic death by 1,000 cuts strategy. Abe leaned back, his chair groaning, in protest. "The code violations are the first cuts. He's painting you as a negligent, polluting neighbor. The nuisance lawsuit is the next cut. He'll get all your new neighbors to sign affidavits about the smell of manure and the sound of your tractor at 5 a.m. By the time you get to the zoning hearing, the board will already see you as a problem that needs solving. He's not trying to win a case. He's trying to tell a story." "So what story do we tell?" Jed asked, feeling a sliver of hope. Abe's presence was like a steadying hand. "We tell the truth, but we tell it louder," Abe said, a glint in his eye. "And we find some of Peterson's own stories and see how true they are." He picked up the inspector's report. "This Ordinance 11B, the one about the runoff, your father fought that tooth and nail. He said the developers of the estates, a company called Viridian Development Group, were pushing it through to avoid having to pay for more expensive drainage solutions on their own property. They wanted to hold the farms upstream to a higher standard than they held themselves to." Abe slid a pair of reading glasses down his nose. "Viridian Development Group. Guess who was their chief legal counsel for the Willow Creek project?" "Richard Peterson," Jed said, the pieces clicking into place. "Bingo," Abe confirmed. "Peterson didn't just move into the neighborhood. He built it, which means his fingerprints are all over the county planning and zoning approvals, and a man in that much of a hurry to build that many houses, he might have cut a corner or two." The battle plan was no longer just about defense. That afternoon, Jed made a call. An hour later, 2 dusty pickup trucks pulled into his driveway. In them were Dale Stewart and Pat Cohen, farmers whose lands bordered Jed's on the far sides, away from the estates. Dale was a big, quiet man who could fix any engine. Pat was wiry and talkative, with an encyclopedic knowledge of every family, property line, and political deal made in the county for the last 50 years. Jed laid out the situation on the hood of Dale's truck. He told them about the zoning petition. He didn't have to explain the implications. They saw the shadow of the estates creeping toward their own fences. "Peterson thinks he can bleed me dry with lawyers and fines until I have to sell," Jed finished. "Abe thinks he might have some skeletons in the closet from when he built this place." "The whole development is a skeleton," Pat Cohen spat. "They tore up the best bottomland in the county. Old man Thompson told my dad they filled in a whole section of marshland to make room for the back 9 of their fancy golf course. Said it was a protected migratory bird nesting area." "Can you prove it?" Jed asked, his heart beating a little faster. "It's just talk now," Dale said, his voice a low rumble. "But the land remembers. Maps from back then would show it." The war room shifted from Abe's study to Jed's barn. Pat went to work digging through the county's online archives, a slow and frustrating process. Dale, meanwhile, had another idea. He knew the land. He knew its contours, its wet spots, its secrets. The harassment from the HOA, meanwhile, escalated. It was no longer just legal threats. It became a campaign of psychological warfare. One morning, Jed woke to find a professional surveyor's flag planted 10 feet inside his property line, a silent, arrogant claim. Another day, a drone with a camera buzzed over his dairy barn for an hour, a clear act of intimidation. On Saturday night, the house at the edge of the estates, the one closest to his own, hosted a massive party with floodlights aimed directly at his pasture and speakers blasting electronic music until 2 in the morning, deliberately spooking his cattle. Each incident was a meticulously documented nuisance for Peterson's lawsuit. Jed felt the pressure mounting, the rage building. It took everything in him not to fire up the John Deere again. Instead, he channeled it. He, Dale, and Pat began to work with a quiet, grim determination. They pulled up old county survey maps from the 1980s, before the development. They cross-referenced them with modern satellite imagery. And there, just as Pat had said, was a discrepancy. A marshy, kidney-shaped area on the old map was now the pristine, rolling green of the 13th and 14th fairways of the Willow Creek Golf Course. "It's not a smoking gun," Abe warned them over the phone. Peterson will say the maps were inaccurate, that they got all the proper environmental clearances. "So we need to find something they can't deny," Dale said. He was looking at the old survey map, his finger tracing a faint dotted line. "What's this?" "An old access road, looks like," Pat said. "Led to a series of test wells the county dug back in the 70s, looking for a new water source." "And where are the wells now?" Jed asked. Pat zoomed in on the satellite image. "Right in the middle of their damn tennis courts. According to state law," Abe later informed them, old test wells had to be properly and permanently sealed with concrete by the developer before any new construction could be built over them. It was an expensive, time-consuming process, the kind of corner a man like Richard Peterson might be tempted to cut. That night, under the cover of a moonless sky, 3 figures dressed in dark clothing cut through a section of fence, separating Dale's property from the back of the Willow Creek Country Club. They carried shovels, a pry bar, and a high-powered ground-penetrating radar unit that Dale had borrowed from a cousin who worked in construction. It was heavy, and the work was slow and tense. Every car that passed on the distant road made them freeze. They set up the GPR unit over the far corner of the immaculate clay tennis courts. Dale, who had studied the manual for 2 straight days, began the scan. He moved the device in a slow, deliberate grid pattern. The screen showed a series of uninteresting lines and blobs, representing compacted earth and layers of clay and gravel. "Anything?" Jed whispered, his eyes scanning the dark, silent houses that bordered the course. "Nothing yet," Dale grunted, sweat beading on his forehead. "Just dirt." They were about to give up. The risk was too great. But as Dale made one last pass near the service line of the court, the image on the screen changed. A new shape appeared. It was a perfect dark vertical cylinder, a void. It plunged straight down, deeper than the machine could read. "Bingo," Dale whispered, a grin spreading across his face. Jed took a shovel. Pat stood watch. The first few inches were soft clay. Then the shovel hit something hard with a dull thunk. It wasn't rock. Jed scraped the clay away. Underneath was a thick, circular steel plate, rusted around the edges. It was a well cap, an old one. He wedged the pry bar under the lip. He and Dale put their full weight on it. With a deep groan of rusted metal, the cap shifted. And from the darkness below, a smell wafted up. Not the earthy scent of a farm, but a foul, chemical stench of stagnant water and something else. Something rotten and industrial. This wasn't an old water well. This was a dumping ground. And it was right under the feet of the people who were trying to fine him for his manure pile. Jed looked at Dale, their faces illuminated by the faint glow of the GPR screen. He wasn't just holding a pry bar anymore. He was holding a weapon. The paper mountain had been built on a foundation of lies, and he had just found the crack.